Miss Helen lived in a small, cozy home in a quiet neighborhood. She was an elderly black woman, respected by everyone who knew her. Her neighbors often described her as sweet and full of wisdom. She had worked hard her entire life, never wasting a penny, and had saved up a modest amount for her retirement. After years of hard work, she was looking forward to a peaceful, worry-free future. She lived on a fixed income, but the money she had saved gave her some security. It wasn't a lot, but it was hers, and it meant everything to her. One afternoon, as she was sitting on her favorite armchair near the window, her phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number, but Miss Helen answered, as she always did. The voice on the other end was friendly, professional, and calm. It introduced itself as someone from her bank, claiming they had special offers for loyal customers like her. Miss Helen had been with her bank for decades, and she trusted them. The voice told her that there was an opportunity to secure a limited-time investment plan that would help her savings grow. At first, Miss Helen was cautious. She had never heard of such an offer before, and something about it seemed too good to be true. But the person on the other end assured her that this was a unique chance to earn more from her savings. They explained that the offer was available only to select customers, and Miss Helen had been chosen because of her long-standing relationship with the bank. The voice was persuasive, calmly explaining all the benefits. They mentioned how secure the investment was, how the returns were guaranteed, and how easy it would be to transfer her money. Miss Helen had always been careful with her finances, but the offer sounded so good that she was tempted. The person on the phone reassured her that everything was legitimate and that it would be quick and safe. Feeling reassured, Miss Helen agreed. She was told that all she needed to do was transfer her savings to a secure account to be enrolled in the program. The phone call seemed to end so quickly, and the person was so polite that it never crossed her mind that something was wrong. Later that day, Miss Helen went to her bank's website to complete the transfer, just like she had been instructed. The website seemed official, and she followed all the steps carefully. She didn't suspect a thing as she typed in her account number and the amount she wanted to transfer. After finishing the transfer, the voice from the call thanked her and assured her that her funds were now safely invested and would grow quickly. But within a day, a feeling of unease began to settle in. Miss Helen couldn't quite shake the nagging feeling that something didn't seem right. When she checked her bank account again, her heart sank. The amount of money she had transferred was gone. Completely gone. The more she checked, the more her worry turned to panic. The website was no longer accessible, and the phone number she had called was disconnected. It hit her like a wave. She had been scammed. Miss Helen sat there, stunned. Her hands trembled as she realized that the money she had saved for so many years, the money she had worked so hard to put away for her future, was now lost. She was heartbroken, but also angry. How could she have been so trusting? How could someone take advantage of her like this? The feeling of betrayal was overwhelming. But as her initial shock started to wear off, something else began to rise within her, a sense of determination. She would not let this be the end. She wasn't going to let these criminals win. Despite the anger and sadness, Ms. Helen knew she needed to take action. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about standing up for herself and making sure this never happened to anyone else. Her next steps were clear. She would fight back. And so, with that thought, Ms. Helen stood up, ready to start figuring out how to get her money back and bring the scammers to justice. She wouldn't be a victim. Not today. Not ever. Ms. Helen sat at her kitchen table, the weight of the situation sinking in. Her hands trembled as she stared at her phone, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The scam had hit her harder than she could have ever imagined. She had always prided herself on being cautious with money, especially after so many years of saving. Now she felt like she had been stripped of something precious, her hard-earned savings, which were meant to secure her future. She had worked tirelessly throughout her life, and all of a sudden, it felt like it had all been taken away in an instant. At first, there was disbelief. She couldn't quite grasp the reality of it. She had been so careful, so trusting of the voice on the phone. She thought she had made the right choice. How could this happen to her? She asked herself over and over again, hoping for some explanation that would make sense of this sudden loss. But nothing made sense. As the days passed, her emotions shifted. She was angry, furious even, but also sad. The sadness settled deep in her chest, like a heavy weight she couldn't shake off. It wasn't just about the money. It was the betrayal that hurt the most. These strangers had targeted her, someone who had never done a thing wrong in her life. They took advantage of her trust, using her kindness and her loyalty to manipulate her into a decision that ruined everything she had worked for. But as time went on, a new feeling began to grow inside her, a sense of resolve. She realized that sitting around feeling sorry for herself wasn't going to help. She needed to take action, to do something about it. She couldn't let these scammers win. She refused to be just another victim. Her pride, her dignity, and her sense of justice wouldn't allow her to let this go unanswered. The first thing she did was gather every piece of information she could find. She pulled out the bank statements she had received in the mail and began combing through them. Her eyes scanned each line, trying to make sense of the numbers, looking for anything that might give her a clue about where the money had gone. She took notes, writing down anything that seemed important. The more she looked, the angrier she became, but she knew this was the only way to start fighting back. Miss Helen also contacted her bank, hoping they could help her reverse the transfer or trace where the money had gone. When she called, she was put on hold for what felt like an eternity. Finally, when a representative answered, she explained everything, hoping for a quick resolution. But the response she got wasn't what she had hoped for. The bank informed her that since the transfer had been authorized by her, there was very little they could do. It was a legal gray area, and her chances of recovering the funds were slim. The news was devastating. She hung up the phone, feeling defeated. But then something inside her stirred. She couldn't just give up. She had spent so much of her life working, planning, and saving. It wasn't just about the money. It was about her integrity and the need for justice. If she gave up now, she would never forgive herself. Determined, she decided to take matters into her own hands. She knew she couldn't let the scammers get away with this. They had taken advantage of her, but she wasn't going to make it easy for them. She would find a way to get her money back and expose them for what they were, criminals who preyed on vulnerable people. This wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. With renewed energy and a sense of purpose, Miss Helen began her mission. She wasn't going to let them win. Not now. Not ever. The fight for justice had just begun. Miss Helen sat down at her desk, papers scattered in front of her, as she began planning her next steps. The anger she had initially felt had started to turn into determination. She wasn't the type of person to let things slide, and this time would be no different. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about showing these scammers that they couldn't take advantage of her, or anyone else for that matter. She had been through too much in her life to be left feeling helpless now. Her first order of business was research. She needed to know who these scammers were, how they worked, and how she could turn the tables on them. She started by searching for any information about similar scams online. She found stories about other elderly people who had fallen victim to the same type of fraud, and she read through each one carefully, taking notes. The more she read, the more she realized that she wasn't alone. There were people out there who had been through the same thing, and they had fought back. If they could do it, so could she. Miss Helen knew she needed to gather as much information as possible. She called her bank again, this time asking for more details. She didn't want to give up on recovering her money, so she kept pushing for answers. The representative on the other end seemed to be more sympathetic this time, but they still told her that they couldn't do much without any concrete evidence or a lead. That didn't stop Miss Helen. She thanked them for their time and hung up the phone, her mind racing with ideas. Next, she turned to technology. Miss Helen was no expert, but she had learned how to use the internet over the years, and she knew there had to be a way to track these criminals down. She spent hours online, looking for patterns in the scam calls, tracking down phone numbers, and trying to find any clue that could lead her to the scammer's identity. She even contacted a few online forums where people discussed scams, hoping someone there might have some advice. As the days went on, she realized just how persistent she needed to be. Every time she found a new piece of information, she followed it up, even when it led to dead ends. It was frustrating at times, but giving up wasn't an option. She couldn't let them get away with what they had done. To make sure she didn't get too overwhelmed, she called on a few of her friends for support. Her neighbor, Mrs. Jackson, had always been someone she could count on. Mrs. Jackson was tech-savvy and had helped Miss Helen with computer issues in the past. When Miss Helen explained what had happened, Mrs. Jackson didn't hesitate to lend a hand. Together, they started organizing the information they had gathered, trying to piece together a plan. One afternoon, while Mrs. Jackson was over at her house, Ms. Helen received another call. This time, it was from an unknown number again. Her heart raced as she picked up the phone, thinking it might be another scammer. But this call was different. It was someone offering assistance, a detective agency that specialized in financial fraud. The woman on the other end explained that they had helped many people recover stolen money and that they had some ideas on how they could track down the criminals who had targeted Miss Helen. The detective's words were like a breath of fresh air. For the first time since the scam, Miss Helen felt hopeful. With her new ally, she felt like she had a fighting chance. She wasn't alone anymore, and she finally had a plan in place. It wasn't going to be easy, but Miss Helen was ready for whatever it took to get her money back and stop these scammers from hurting anyone else. The real work was about to begin. Miss Helen felt a renewed sense of determination as she sat down with Mrs. Jackson, ready to take on the challenge of tracking down the scammers. Together, they began organizing all the information they had gathered so far. They spread out the phone records, online research, and any leads they had found. It was clear that this wasn't going to be an easy task, but Miss Helen wasn't the type to back down from a challenge. The detective agency had given them a few tips, and Miss Helen was now more focused than ever. They began by making sure they had all the details about the fraudulent transfer. Miss Helen wrote down every little detail from the phone call: the date, the time, the exact words that had been said. She even recalled the voice on the other end, how smooth and convincing it had sounded. These small details, she hoped, would help lead them in the right direction. As the days went on, the pair worked tirelessly. They dug deeper into the information they had. They used online search tools to trace the phone numbers that had been used to contact her, but nothing solid came up. Most of the numbers had been untraceable or linked to fake businesses. However, Ms. Helen wasn't discouraged. She had learned by now that sometimes you had to dig deeper and be patient. So, she and Mrs. Jackson kept looking, refusing to let the frustration slow them down. They reached out to others who had fallen victim to similar scams, hoping to find patterns or connections. Slowly, a few people started to respond, sharing their experiences. Some of them had been scammed in similar ways, with phone calls that promised incredible investment opportunities. It became clear that these scammers were part of a bigger operation, one that had targeted not just Miss Helen but many others. The stories were heartbreaking, but they also gave Miss Helen a sense of solidarity. She wasn't alone, and together, they could make a difference. One day, as Miss Helen was sifting through more information, she stumbled across something important. She found a name linked to one of the phone numbers, a name that appeared on a few websites associated with financial scams. It was a lead. It wasn't much, but it was a start. She couldn't believe it. This was the breakthrough she had been waiting for. Excited but cautious, she immediately shared the information with the detective agency. They confirmed that the name was connected to a known fraud ring operating in another state. This was huge. Ms. Helen felt a rush of adrenaline. For the first time since the scam, she felt like she was getting closer to justice. The detective assured her that they would follow up, using their resources to track down the scammers. But Ms. Helen wasn't going to sit back and wait. she decided to take matters into her own hands in a way that was smart and safe. She reached out to local authorities, explaining what she had uncovered so far. She even provided them with the name she had found. To her relief, the police were willing to investigate further. They appreciated her persistence and her willingness to help. With all the pieces slowly falling into place, Ms. Helen felt more confident than ever. She had no intention of letting these criminals get away with what they had done. Every step of the way, she had grown stronger and more determined. What had started as a devastating loss had turned into a fight for justice, and Ms. Helen was ready for the next step, bringing these scammers to justice once and for all. As Ms. Helen sat in her living room, the foam in her hand felt heavier than it ever had before. The information she had uncovered, the name, the lead, it was all starting to come together. The scammers, who had initially seemed untouchable, were now closer than ever to being caught. But Ms. Helen knew that the path to justice wasn't going to be easy. There was still much more to do, and it required her to be both patient and smart. She sat down with Mrs. Jackson, who had been her ally throughout this entire journey. The two of them had become a team, one driven by determination, the other by the need to see justice done. Mrs. Jackson had been helpful with the online searches, and now Ms. Helen felt like they were on the brink of something big. Together, they began strategizing the next move. The name Ms. Helen had found had opened a door, but it wasn't enough to bring the scammers down on its own. They needed more solid proof. They needed to catch the criminals in the act. So they decided to set a trap, a smart, calculated move that would give the police all the evidence they needed to take action. Ms. Helen didn't hesitate. She knew it was time to get involved directly. With the detective agency's guidance, she started preparing to bait the scammers. She created a new email account, one that looked like a potential victim, someone who was new to the process and unaware of the danger. The email was set up with a fake backstory about how Ms. Helen's relative had recently received an offer similar to the one she had received. The scammers, who were always on the lookout for new targets, would surely take the bait. It took a few tries, but eventually they got a response. The scammers didn't waste any time. They immediately contacted the fake identity, just as they had done with Ms. Helen. The tone of the message was eerily familiar, promising incredible returns and a safe investment opportunity. Ms. Helen couldn't help but feel a rush of satisfaction. The scammers had walked right into the trap. With the scam details now in their possession, Ms. Helen and Mrs. Jackson passed everything along to the detective agency, who quickly worked to confirm that the scammers were indeed operating illegally. The agency also made sure to involve the police, who were now working with Ms. Helen's information to prepare for a full-scale operation. The scammers were about to be caught, and everything was about to change. But Ms. Helen wasn't stopping there. As she continued to help the authorities, she took every opportunity to spread the word. She talked to her neighbors, her friends, and anyone who would listen. She wanted others to know how easy it was to fall into the trap and how important it was to stay vigilant. She didn't want anyone else to go through what she had endured. Through her determination, she had not only started to bring the scammers down, but also educated others on how to protect themselves from falling victim to fraud. The plan was set into motion. The scammers had been lured in, and now it was time for them to be exposed. Ms. Helen knew there was still much work to be done, but she could feel the momentum building. She was finally getting her power back. The scammers may have thought they had gotten away with it, but now they were about to face the consequences. It was a victory she could already taste, and it would be even sweeter when the authorities made their move. Ms. Helen's heart raced as she sat by the phone, waiting for news. The weeks of hard work, the long hours spent researching, the hours spent talking to people, all of it was about to pay off. She had helped set the stage for the scammers to be caught. And now, the authorities were getting ready to make their move. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had been hurt by people like the ones who had stolen her savings. She had become a symbol of persistence, someone who wasn't afraid to stand up for what was right. Every day, She received updates from the detective agency, and each one brought her closer to the final step. The authorities had confirmed the location of the scammers' operation, and they were preparing to close in. It was thrilling, but also nerve-wracking. Ms. Helen didn't know exactly when or how the bust would go down, but she trusted that the professionals were handling it. One afternoon, as she sat with Mrs. Jackson, sipping tea, Ms. Helen's phone buzzed. It was a message from the detective agency. The moment she read the words, she felt a wave of excitement flood her chest. The scammers had taken the bait. They had been caught, and the authorities were closing in. The detective explained that the operation was underway and that everything was going according to plan. They had enough evidence to make arrests, and the scammers' operation would soon be dismantled. Ms. Helen could hardly believe it. The criminals who had stolen from her and so many others were finally going to face the consequences of their actions. She felt a mix of relief and satisfaction. For the first time since the scam, she felt like she had some control again. The powerless feeling she had experienced when she first realized her savings were gone had been replaced with a sense of justice. The scammer's grip on her life was finally loosening. The detective asked her if she wanted to be present when the scammers were arrested. It was a bold offer, and Miss Helen hesitated for only a moment before agreeing. She wanted to see the moment when they were exposed for what they truly were: criminals who had preyed on the vulnerable and taken advantage of trust for their own gain. A few days later, the moment arrived. Ms. Helen, along with the detectives and a few officers, stood quietly outside the building where the scammers had been operating. The authorities had confirmed the location, and they were ready to strike. Ms. Helen could feel her pulse quicken as they prepared for the raid. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. She had helped bring these criminals down, and now they would finally face justice. The operation was swift. Officers stormed the building, and the scammers were arrested one by one. The shock on their faces was priceless. These individuals, who had once thought they could get away with anything, were now being handcuffed and led away. Their assets were frozen, and their illegal operation was over. The police had gathered enough evidence to ensure that they would be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. As Ms. Helen watched the scene unfold, she couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. She had been a part of something bigger than herself. Her persistence had paid off, and she had helped protect countless other people from falling victim to the same scam. She knew there would still be work to be done, but seeing the criminals who had taken so much from her finally caught brought her a sense of peace. It wasn't just about recovering her money anymore. It was about making sure that no one else would have to suffer like she had. Ms. Helen smiled to herself, knowing that her determination had led to the downfall of those who believed they could take advantage of others. In the end, she had proven that no one, no matter how small or vulnerable, was ever truly powerless when they fought for what was right. The days following the arrest of the scammers felt surreal for Ms. Helen. She had lived through the initial shock of the scam, the confusion, the anger, and then the long process of uncovering the truth. Now, as she watched the criminals being led away in handcuffs, it was hard for her to grasp the full extent of what had just happened. The entire ordeal had felt like a storm, intense and overwhelming. But now, finally, the storm had passed. She stood there, in the background, watching as the authorities secured the scene. There were reporters from local news stations taking pictures, and a few neighbors had gathered outside, curious to see what was going on. Ms. Helen couldn't help but feel a sense of pride, knowing that her persistence had brought this all to light. She had taken back control of her life, and in doing so, had helped protect others from the same fate. The next few days were a whirlwind of phone calls, interviews, and paperwork. The police kept Ms. Helen updated, informing her about the legal proceedings and how the scammers would be prosecuted. She was asked to provide more details about how she had uncovered their operation, and her role in helping to catch them became an important part of the case. It was clear that her determination had played a crucial role in exposing the criminals, and the authorities were grateful for her effort. But despite the attention, Ms. Helen remained humble. She didn't want the recognition. She just wanted to make sure that what happened to her didn't happen to anyone else. She knew that she had been lucky. She had gotten her money back, and the scammers were facing the consequences of their actions, but not everyone was so fortunate. Many people fell victim to scams every day, and Miss Helen was determined to raise awareness. She began reaching out to local organizations that helped protect the elderly and vulnerable from financial fraud. She volunteered to share her story, hoping that her experience could teach others how to avoid falling into the same trap. She knew she wasn't an expert, but her first-hand knowledge would help others understand how scams worked and how they could protect themselves. At one of the meetings, Miss Helen met a woman who had lost a significant amount of money to a similar scam. The woman was devastated, just as Miss Helen had been when she first realized what had happened. But as Miss Helen spoke about her own experience and how she had fought back, she could see a spark of hope in the woman's eyes. The woman had been so focused on her loss that she hadn't thought about taking action, but Miss Helen's story gave her the courage to start looking into ways to recover her money and prevent it from happening again. Miss Helen felt a deep sense of fulfillment as she spoke to more people, sharing the lessons she had learned. Her words resonated with others, and slowly but surely, she saw a shift in how people approached scams. They began to ask questions, seek help, and take steps to protect themselves. Miss Helen realized that by standing up for herself, she had helped to create a ripple effect that extended far beyond her own experience. As the legal proceedings against the scammers continued, Miss Helen felt a growing sense of peace. She had done what she set out to do. Her savings were safe once again, and the criminals who had thought they could get away with exploiting vulnerable people were being held accountable. In the end, it wasn't just about her own personal victory. It was about making a difference in her community, ensuring that no one would have to endure the same betrayal. Looking back, Miss Helen couldn't help but feel proud of the journey she had been on. It had been difficult, yes, but it had also taught her something important, that no matter how tough life got, she had the strength to stand up and fight back. And in doing so, she had proven that even in the face of adversity, justice could be served. The final chapter of Miss Helen's journey was one filled with a sense of calm, but also pride. The scammers had been caught, and her savings were returned. The legal proceedings were in full swing, and the criminals who had stolen from her were facing the consequences of their actions. For the first time in months, Miss Helen could finally take a breath, knowing that the ordeal was over. But as she sat quietly in her favorite chair by the window, she realized that this wasn't just the end. It was also the beginning of something new. In the weeks that followed, Miss Helen found herself surrounded by people who admired her strength and determination. Her story had inspired others, and she had become a source of hope for many who had been victims of scams. She had taken what could have been a devastating experience and turned it into something powerful. It wasn't just about recovering her money. It was about showing everyone that they had the power to fight back, no matter the odds. Ms. Helen continued to speak at local meetings and share her story. She visited community centers, schools, and senior groups, teaching people how to spot the signs of a scam and how to protect themselves. As she shared her experience, she noticed a change in how people approached their own finances. They were more cautious, more aware, and more willing to ask questions when something didn't seem right. It was a small but significant shift, and Ms. Helen knew that she had played a part in that. One evening, as she was sitting with Mrs. Jackson, sipping tea and reflecting on the journey, Ms. Helen realized just how far she had come. She had started out feeling helpless, angry, and confused, but now she was someone who had not only recovered her life savings, but had also helped prevent others from falling into the same trap. Her story had become a beacon of hope, and she was proud of that. But even with all the attention, the media coverage, and the newfound recognition, Ms. Helen stayed grounded. She wasn't in it for the fame or the praise. She was in it because she knew how important it was to protect vulnerable people from exploitation. She didn't want anyone else to experience the feeling of betrayal she had felt when the scammers first took her money. In some ways, she felt like her fight wasn't over yet. She continued working with organizations that focused on financial education for the elderly and vulnerable. She spent time talking to people who had been affected by similar scams, offering them guidance and support. Ms. Helen knew that the fight against scams wasn't over. It was a long-term battle that required constant awareness and education. Over time, Ms. Helen's life slowly returned to normal. She spent more time gardening, reading, and enjoying the peace she had worked so hard for. But she never stopped fighting for justice, and she never stopped spreading the word. Her story had made a difference, and she was determined to ensure that it kept making an impact. Looking back, Ms. Helen knew that everything she had been through had shaped her into the person she was now. She had faced a difficult challenge, but she had come out stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever to make the world a better place. Her story wasn't just about overcoming a scam. It was about proving to herself and to others that no matter what life throws at you, you can always rise above it. She had won her battle, but she knew that the fight for justice was never truly over. And she would keep fighting, one step at a time, for as long as it took.